Good evening and welcome to a live broadcast from the Debate Watch Party at the City Club of Cleveland, presented by the Cleveland Foundation in partnership with the Cleveland Young Professional Senate and ideastream. Thank you. I'm Michael Murphy, Chief Marketing Officer of the Cleveland Foundation, and it's my pleasure to introduce our panel conversation on the issues and dynamics at play in the 2016 election, including at tonight's debate among 10 of the candidates for the Republican nomination for president. That debate, of course, is sponsored by Fox News and the Ohio Republican Party and will begin in just an hour across the street, a few blocks away at Quicken Loans Arena. We're pleased that ideastream reporter Nick Castele is with us to moderate our panel, which should be a little less contentious than the proceedings at the Q. Before I hand it off to Nick to introduce our panelists, let me just note how fitting it is that the first debate in the GOP race is happening here in Cleveland, where this whole process will culminate next summer at the Republican National Convention. Very good. And here we are, ready for a feast of political conversation. We'll do this in the usual City Club way. The first half hour for the panel conversation, and the second half hour for questions from all of you. If you're listening on WCPN or watching us on our web stream at cityclub.org and you'd like to send us a question, Twitter works best. Tweet it at the City Club or use the hashtag CLE2016. All right then, it's time to meet our panelists. To introduce them, let me hand it off to our moderator, ideastream reporter, and occasional host, Nick Castele.
Thank you very much. Less contentious, that's what you think. I'm only kidding. Thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you for listening on 90.3 WCPN. This is a City Club conversation about the first Republican debate of this election cycle. I'm Nick Castele. I am a reporter and producer with WCPN and WVIZ ideastream. Joining me are Karen Beckwith, the chair of the Political Science Department at Case Western Reserve University and the Flora Stone Mather Professor there. We have John Green, the director of the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron, and Jakiel Sanders, the chair of Government Affairs, the chair for Government Affairs at the Young Professional Senate. Thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you for participating in this conversation. As you heard, we'll spend a bit of time here talking about what to watch for in this debate tonight and what are the issues facing Republicans as they get ready for this 2016 presidential contest. And then we'll turn the conversation over to you and welcome your questions and bring you into this conversation to hear what you would like us to address as we wait for the debate here. I wanted to start with Karen Beckwith at Case Western. We're going to have 10 candidates on stage tonight. There's going to be a lot of people competing for our attention, and this is just one of many debates that we'll be seeing from the Republicans this cycle. What can we really expect to learn from this debate with so many people competing for our attention?
Well, we'll be able to learn who's careful. We'll be able to learn who has the right answer if they're asked to, why do you want to be president, which I think is the first question that should be asked. We'll find out if people are able to handle questions that are disconcerting or unanticipated. And we also should pay attention to what people are crafting in terms of what they want to say. So are they saying something about themselves? Are they saying something about themselves that differentiates themselves from the other candidates? Or are they saying something that differentiates themselves from the presumed candidate of the Democratic Party? So those are some things to be looking for. And then I know that the news media will also be looking to see who makes a mistake.
So this is a pressure, no forced errors here, no unforced errors here is what we're waiting for. John Green at University of Akron, give us a lay of the land here. Who are these candidates on the stage? What backgrounds do they bring with them? You can give us the spark notes if you like, because I know there's a lot of them.
Well, it's a really diverse group. Many of you know the group was chosen based on poll information. And the top 10...
Why don't you give, for some reason these mics aren't working.
Okay. I'm saying, as you all know, the 10 candidates that were... Well, I'll just speak louder. The 10 candidates were chosen because of the average of 5 polls, and so not all 17 candidates could be in the debate, just the top 10. And they're really quite a varied group. They didn't actually capture all of the variation of the Republican field because the one woman in the race somehow didn't make it into the top 10, but that's not that surprising. things like that happen in American politics. But we have people from the private sector, like Donald Trump, and Ben Carson, who's a fairly famous surgeon before he got into politics, governors such as our own John Kasich and Chris Christie, senators such as Marco Rubio and Rand Paul, and then a very familiar name in American politics, Jeb Bush, a former governor of Florida. So it's really quite a diverse group. And politics aside, it's a fairly accomplished group. These are folks with really pretty good resumes.
Jakiel Sanders, what are you listening for in this debate here? Are there any issues that you're listening to hear these candidates address?
As a young person, I'm listening for issues that will be affecting people like myself and my community, and not just today, but also in the generations to come, because policy that's set today has long-lasting effects. I would like to hear something about what are these politicians think we can do to revitalize our crumbling infrastructure in this country. You know, Cleveland's a city of bridges, and we're grateful to have our I-90 bridge being rebuilt, and it'll be done within a year. But we also have a number of other bridges and just infrastructure that's invisible, like our sewer system, that needs to be updated and upgraded. I would like to hear something about that. I'd also like to hear something about what any of the candidates think they can do about the student loan debt crisis that's looming ahead of us. It's causing a lot of young people to delay major life decisions like marriage and home buying and other things like that. So I'd like to hear about infrastructure, student loan debt, and possibly, but I know it's the third round politics, what they might do to reform entitlement programs so that they are sustainable for the long term, such that my generation will be able to enjoy the benefits that generations before us have.
I want to stay with that idea for just a second. You said as a young person you're hoping that they will speak to these issues. You know, one of the things that the Republican Party did after 2012 was a lot of soul searching about how do we broaden our tent, how do we welcome in constituencies who in the past maybe are more likely to vote Democratic, and that, you know, young people falls into that group, women voters, African American, Hispanic voters. I'm wondering if you're listening for candidates to speak to you as a young person, do you feel like you're hearing that message yet? And I want to bring everyone into this conversation about is the tent getting any bigger? Are you hearing that message that, yes, we want to welcome in constituencies and speak to young people maybe who have not voted for Republicans in the past?
I heard them speak about making the tent bigger after the 2012 election during the quote-unquote autopsy. But in the subsequent election in 2014, I saw that the tent contracted and became smaller and more concentrated as people ran towards the base to win the elections that they needed for the midterm. And I'm not seeing much of that big tent philosophy coming into play right now either.
John Green, you know, this is going to be, of course, a debate for the primary. This is a conservative base audience, maybe, that might be listening in because they are going to be the voters. How do you think Republicans might handle that tension between trying to broaden the tent and also trying to appeal to the base who are going to be voting in this primary?
You know, I think it's going to be a real challenge because the candidates have different kinds of motivations. Some of the candidates think that they can appeal to a narrow portion of the Republican base so that they can win the nomination. Now, of course, at some point, if they do win the nomination, they've got to appeal to a lot more voters. But there are other candidates that want to start with a broad appeal from the very beginning, arguing that their experience and their vision is really much more inclusive. So I think there's quite a tension among these candidates because each one has a somewhat different strategy, and therefore their debate performance will vary considerably.
Karen Beckwith, we've got so many different issues that candidates could potentially address tonight. Immigration, social issues, same-sex marriage, abortion, the Iran deal. Do you think there's any room in these issues for these candidates to maneuver, to stake out positions that are really significantly different from one another? Or is this more about trying to hit points that will appeal to primary voters?
Well, they're speaking to the primary constituency first and foremost. And the problem for all of them, despite diverse strategies, is the same problem, which is they have to win the primary electorate first. And they have to win it in public. So they have to win it where everyone can see what they have to say. And then they have to turn and appeal to the broader electorate, which is a distinctly different electorate. And the Republican primary electorate is a different electorate than the Republican general election electorate. So they have this problem in terms of issues. My guess is that there will be several issues that they won't address and that there will be several issues that they'll be very careful on. I think same-sex marriage is not going to be an issue that anyone will talk about. Now, I didn't see the 5 o'clock premier debate. I don't know that they spoke about that at all. I'll be surprised if there are questions about that. And there's some other issues I think that they will probably keep their hands off. I know that they've been advised, at least the questioners have been advised, to focus not on the differences among them, but on their differences with the presumed Democratic candidate on the other side.
And one issue in particular I wanted to touch on, and Karen Beckwith, where do you think these candidates are going to come down on the issue of immigration?
I think that's a really good question. I think probably many of them are hoping to be silent on it. I think John's point that some will be looking to differentiate themselves more narrowly, others will be trying to speak to a broader constituency. I wish those speaking to a broader constituency good luck, because again, they have to get past first that primary electorate, and that's going to be difficult. It'll be interesting to see what people have to say about immigration. In the Growth and Opportunity Project report, which was the so-called postmortem for the 2012 elections, the Republican National Party made a big push to be more inclusive, and they specifically addressed a variety of issues of importance to particular demographic groups in the United States. The problem for the Republican candidates right now, or the problem for the Republican Party, is that they can't discipline their candidates. That is, if you have enough money to run, and I mean that in the political science sense. They can't say you can't run if you don't adhere to the principles in this report, because if you can self-finance, or if you can find someone to finance your campaign for you, sometimes even a single individual with a lot of money, this means that you can do what you want and say what you want. And so you can say things about our neighbors to the south that are literally reprehensible and that violate the principles in that contract. So it's going to be not contract, but then in that report. So also there's another tension, which is the tension between the Republican Party writ large and what individual candidates are able to do and say.
John Green, you want to jump in on that question there?
To jump in on that, I think this is, Karen makes an excellent point, that there's a difference between the party leadership and the various candidates. And the party leadership has concluded that the party needs to be more inclusive. And one of the reasons this debate is being held in Cleveland, and one of the reasons the National Convention is being held in Cleveland, is to indicate to whoever might want to notice that the party leaders want to be more inclusive. Now, whether the party's nominees want to be more inclusive is a really different story.
Jakiel Sanders, do you think that you're seeing that dynamic at play? Are there any issues that come up to you when you're thinking about, these candidates have come to Cleveland, they've come to Northeast Ohio to speak to us, an audience from Northeast Ohio. Do you feel like they are speaking to those issues that matter to you as someone who lives in this region?
Right now, as I'm listening to the candidates in the debate, I'm not hearing a lot of what would matter to born here Midwestern boy, because I'm hearing a lot about a certain candidate saying they're going to build a wall on the southern border and make our neighbors to the south pay for it, which is not something that is a big, play for us here in Northeast Ohio. We don't have the same problems as say Texas, but we do, like I said earlier, are a rebuilding industrial Rust Belt city. And what are the economic policies that will help this city grow and flourish in the 21st century? I'm just hearing a lot of the same talking points of, deregulation, lower taxes equals growth. But what actual policies will make that happen?
And now we've talked a little bit about how after the 2012 election, Republicans, at least the party leadership, focused on this idea of, we need to broaden the tent. We need to focus on being a more inclusive party. And there was even a vote in the Senate on immigration reform, which then died in the House, or at least was stopped in the House. Eric Kander, a member of the House leadership, lost his primary vote, and some people thought that his stance on immigration was a part of that. Then Donald Trump gets into the race, and and he's made comments that have gotten a lot of attention in his stance on immigration. John Green, do you think Donald Trump's appearance here in the race has changed the way these candidates might be talking to one another or talking about one another?
Well, it's certainly changed the expectations that people have about the debate. It's interesting, there was a poll earlier this week where people were asked, who do you think will win the debate? And the answer had something to do with the candidates they favored. People tend to think their candidate would win. But then the second question that followed was, who do you think will get the most publicity? And 2/3 of the respondents said Donald Trump. So I think there's an expectation that Trump's going to kind of light up the stage with some of his one-liners. But there's some other, how shall we put it, strong personalities on that stage. Chris Christie, Mike Huckabee, people who are used to kind of having it their own way. So I think a lot of people may be tuning in tonight expecting to see some verbal fisticuffs. I don't know that we'll see that, but particularly because of what Donald Trump has done in the last few weeks, I think that's become part of the expectation.
And of course, one of those personalities on the stage is Ohio's Governor, John Kasich, and I want to get to his candidacy in just a second. If you are just joining us on 90.3, you're listening to a City Club conversation about the Republican debate, which will be starting shortly here. I'm Nick Castele from WCPN ideastream. I'm joined by Karen Beckwith of Case Western Reserve University, John Green of the Bliss Institute at the University of Akron, and Jakiel Sanders from the Young Professional Senate. Karen Beckwith, let me ask you about John Kasich. He has made it now into this top 10, so he will be on the, the varsity squad of the debate. And yet he is at the very bottom of that list in terms of poll numbers, and I believe he edged out Rick Perry within the margin of error. So he just made it in. He is behind 9 other candidates. How do you think the governor is going to stand out, or what are the challenges facing somebody who still has an uphill climb in terms of poll numbers?
So I think the governor has not done himself any damage thus far. And so perhaps staying out as long as he has and waiting and coming in at the end hasn't been the world's worst strategy. So I know that's faint praise, but I think he has in many ways positioned himself very well in this regard. Again, his big challenge will be to differentiate himself. And my guess is he'll be lucky if he can differentiate himself from another Midwestern governor in an attempt to attract more support from a broader electorate, and that would be Scott Walker from Wisconsin. So Walker's numbers in the polls have been dropping, but he's still in the top 10, and a lot of things can happen tonight and in the subsequent months. So he'll have to differentiate himself from Walker, and I think that will be helpful for him. And he'll have to be able to speak about Ohio in the positive ways that will resonate not just with the Republican primary electorate, but with the general electorate, and I think he'll have some opportunity for that. My understanding, I don't know the governor personally, is that he's occasionally subject to small fits of temper that don't go over well personally, but that are highly attractive to the mass media. And so his ability to be the calm, judicious, governing executive that we all hope he is will show up in the debates.
There has been some attention paid to questions of temperament or questions of speaking off script. I believe his announcement speech announcing he was running for president was not pre-written. I think a lot of it, or at least had the appearance of being off the cuff, and so that's a question that's been brought up. Another way the governor stands out from some others in the field is that he's chosen to expand Medicaid in Ohio under the Affordable Care Act, which is something that, for some candidates with a conservative base, the term Obamacare is not one you want to be connected with. I'm wondering, John Green, how do you think that dynamic is going to play out? You've got, that at least is one significant policy difference between Governor Kasich and other candidates who will be on the stage.
Well, I think here in this debate and in the early going, I think that can help him. Because if you look at what John Kasich's done in terms of policy here in Ohio, he's an unorthodox Republican. In some ways very conservative, in some ways much less conservative. And so he's got some material with which to distinguish himself from some of the other candidates. But one has to wonder down the road if that lack of orthodoxy might be a problem, because in many of the primary states, as Karen was indicating, the Republican primary voters are quite conservative, and they may not find this departure from the script to be all that valuable or interesting.
Jakiel, your take on that? I mean, are you paying attention to the ways in which Governor Kasich might stand out from other candidates? Or are there things that you're listening for to hear what the governor has to say tonight to see how he would distinguish himself from the others?
Yes, I definitely would like to see how Governor Kasich embraces his choice to expand Medicaid in the state. I think it was great for the state and the people of Ohio. I'd also like to see, he did make a push in his last budget to reform the school funding system in the state of Ohio, which I know education reform is a key topic among a lot of Republicans opposing the Common Core, and John Kasich is one of the few that is embracing the Common Core. I find it interesting that the two of the candidates that do embrace the Common Core are actual governors that have to get things done in their states. So I think on those things, like John Green said, that he is an unorthodox Republican, and he has sometimes even pushed back against his own Republican legislature.
That's something you bring up about, some of the candidates who have embraced Common Core are governors. There's been some talk about the difference in this race between the governors and the senators, and I know there's a few others as well. What do you make of that difference? Do you think you've heard anything significantly different from the governors running than from the senators? The governors have to run a state. The senators are voting on legislation.
Well, I think the senators, they'll give you more rhetoric and grandstanding. The Senate is a place for debate and discussion, whereas governors, they actually have to execute, and in some states, they have to work with people who are not of their same party. So they have to make deals to get things done, to actually make their state run. Like in Ohio, we have to balance our budget, and we have to have a budget that gets done on time, unlike our federal government where they can make some maneuvers and everything. But so John Kasich actually makes things happen, and we move forward as a state, even though you may disagree with his policies.
Karen Beckwith, you say that there's another big difference you wanted to point out between governors and senators?
The state of Ohio doesn't have a foreign policy. And so that's a big difference. Foreign policy comes from the Senate and from the House and from the President. And so that's the one place where senators can speak with some confidence. And it's not a big surprise that Hillary Clinton, for example, and also Kristen Gillibrand now as well, have served on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So there's, for those who might have presidential ambitions, at least in the Senate, there are ways to get that foreign policy experience, which allows you to say things that governors can't say. So Jakiel's absolutely right about the executive experience. That's a very strong thing. But in terms of wider foreign policy, senators do have that advantage.
On the question of foreign policy, do you think there's a lot of space for these candidates to maneuver? I mean, two big questions that will probably come up tonight are the Iran deal and dealing with ISIS. And that was something, those were both issues that were, I believe, brought up in the earlier debate tonight with the lower polling candidates. Do you think all the candidates will be mostly singing the same tune on those two issues, or do you think they may differentiate one another from themselves from that?
I'm confident they'll sing the same tune. I'm confident that in the party among those candidates, there's only one right answer. ISIS is bad, and we have to defeat them. And the Iran deal was bad. We will have to overturn it. So I think, or we'll have to defeat it in the Senate. So I think that won't differentiate people. It's interesting to me, looking at the poll data, what the issues appear to be right now, at least in the context of the campaign. The number one issue in the Pew Research polls, and there are some exceptions to this, the top three are all about the economy. The economy is the big issue. Unemployment is the secondary component of the economic issues. But these are the things that people are addressing. Education is up there. Healthcare is also up there. Issues of foreign policy are much lower down. The only foreign policy issue that gets at least 19% identification in the Pew poll is terrorism. But other foreign policy issues, even immigration, is an issue that's not in double digits, at least right now. Now, it's the job of the candidates to make some of those issues important issues and to draw attention to them, and that's something that we might want to watch for.
I think it's an interesting question, and John Green, I wondered your thoughts on this. You could say maybe that the 2008 election was a referendum on the Bush years, and the 2012 election a referendum on the first term of President Obama's time in the White House. What is this 2016 election going to be about? Is this another referendum on Obama, or is this something else? Do we know yet what the issues are going to be that really define this election?
Well, in many respects, it will be a referendum on the Obama administration. And that's because we have a very strong 8-year cycle in American politics. Like most cycles in politics, it's not perfect. Sometimes it's a little shorter, sometimes it's a little longer. But after one party's been in power for a while, then part of the debate is, well, what will the changes be? But I don't think we know what aspects of the Obama administration will be forefront in the campaign, because we really don't know who the nominees will be. We have a little clearer idea perhaps on the Democratic side, the frontrunner having been a member of the Obama administration. But on the Republican side, we really don't know. I mean, we will have a governor who wants to talk about the economy and government management. Are we going to have a senator who wants to talk about foreign policy? There's a lot of different ways to have a referendum on the previous administration.
Jakiel Sanders, something that came up in the earlier debate, there was a discussion of what candidates would do as soon as they got into office. And a lot of them talked about executive actions or something to begin to reverse the legacy of President Obama. And something we had talked about before we come up on this panel was whether Obamacare is going to be an issue in this race among Republicans or not. Are there certain aspects you think of the Obama presidency that you expect might come up or might be a point of debate, or are there aspects of it that you hope are just settled at this point and maybe won't be discussed as an open question?
I think in the next presidency, it's going to depend on the president, but also it's going to depend on the Congress. Because if you've got a sympathetic Congress to the president, if it's a Democratic president with a more than likely split Congress, then it's going to be muddling through, in my opinion. But if it's a a Republican president with a strong Republican Congress, then it might very well be that you've got a Republican Congress sending a repeal bill to the president's desk. And then that president, if they had campaigned on that issue, is under pressure to actually sign it, even though it's a bill it's a law that's been through the Supreme Court twice and has been upheld on 2 separate occasions. So that's the thing that could happen.
Mm-hmm. Another issue, or another thing that we've learned about the candidates recently is how much money they've been raising and how much money their super PACs have been raising as well. Karen Beckwith, I know you've been looking through a lot of the financial disclosures, reading through all of these. What have we learned right now about who is funding the Republican candidates and who's funding the super PACs that many of them have also, had built up alongside their campaigns?
Well, campaign finance law has been changed, as we all know, by a variety of decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, starting with Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976 and Citizens United just a few years ago. I won't talk, if you'll indulge me, about who's funding whom, but how much funding is going on and the difference it's going to make among the candidates. So right now, and I want to talk just a little bit about why this is important or not important. So the person who has the most funding right now, both self-funded, raised through individual PACs and from individual donors, and then from super PACs, is Jeb Bush. He leads beyond anyone else. He has nearly twice as much funding available to him as does Hillary Clinton, who's number 2. And so when we go down the list of who has funding, then we begin to see not so much funding for people like Ted Cruz and others. I think he has only $14 million in funding, which isn't very much. Some of these, though, and in Cruz's case in particular, are from just a few super donors. And again, this is why some of these candidates will be able to stay in the race for a long time if they can rely on this financing in the way that Newt Gingrich did in 2012, if I have the date right, 2008. 2012. How long ago it seems to me now. They can stay in the race and they can persist with that funding, and there's no reason to get out if you enjoy the campaigning and if you enjoy the intention. But the money is not the only dispositive factor in the campaign. The money is very, very important, and raising it early is very important. At the very least, it used to at least scare people off. It used to scare off competitors. That's clearly not the case if there are 17 people and Jim Gilmore just gets into the race. But the other thing that's important are endorsements. And right now the list of endorsements is led actually by Chris Christie, by endorsements from House members, senators, and governors. I think Jeb Bush's second, Hillary Clinton, is up there as well. John Kasich has a few endorsements. Whether or not this leads people or is a reflection of what politicians think is going to happen is not clear to me, but the endorsement part is also very important.
Can you explain briefly what is important about the endorsement part? I mean, endorsements don't get you ads on TV like campaign contributions do, but where do those have an effect on the electorate?
Well, I think it does have 2 effects. So one effect is, again, it says something to the other candidates. These are people who support me, and they're not supporting you. And so this says something about your campaign. It says something about my campaign. It says something about the strength of my campaign and my abilities. And then the other, I think, is a signal to potential voters, or at least those in the primary electorate. We know these names. These are senators. These are governors. They're endorsing Jeb Bush. They're endorsing Marco Rubio. We need to pay attention to this. And so I think it does send a signal to voters that gives a lift to the candidates.
If you're just joining us on 90.3, you're listening to a City Club conversation about the Republican debate, the first Republican debate of this 2016 cycle being held in Cleveland in just about 30 minutes. I'm Nick Castele from WCPN, WVIZ ideastream. I'm joined by Karen Beckwith at Case Western Reserve University, John Green from the University of Akron, and Jakiel Sanders from the Young Professional Senate. We're going to turn now to the question and answer session of this conversation and welcome our audience here at the City Club into the discussion. Holding our microphones are, I've got their names, holding our microphones are Liz Falco and Grant Gavagna. And so, do we need this microphone?
Oh, sorry.
We'll work it out. Okay, and so simply just raise your hands and we'll have people holding the microphones come around to you and we'll get to as many questions as we can. First question, yes, sir.
It was mentioned earlier that one of the goals for the candidates in this debate was to not make mistakes. Now, I'm going to ask you to play campaign manager. If you represented John Kasich or Governor Christie, and you're 9th or 10th in the polls right now, would you recommend them be more bold in this particular debate, or would you tell them to play it safe and let the other candidates make mistakes and come to them? Thank you.
Well, both. I mean, they need to be bold in the sense that they need to get attention. And so they need to find something that they can talk about that will distinguish them from the other candidates, and particularly with this large audience that's going to be watching them on TV. But of course, there's always a danger when you try to be bold of saying something that you didn't mean to say, right? Something that's controversial that doesn't generate the impression you want, but really a different kind of impression. So, I think in the debate preparation, I'm sure these candidates work with their teams to think about, well, how can we say something distinctive and attractive without getting ourselves in a lot of trouble?
Another question?
Do you find the debate format a benefit or a disservice to the voters? Is 10 candidates on stage too many? Conversely, should all 17 be on? Was the method of selection a fair method?
Karen Beckwith?
Ooh. So I don't know if the manner of selection was a fair selection, because I don't know how much discussion there was between the Republican National Committee and Fox News, for example. And I was a little surprised that Fox News let this go on for so long, although it got them a lot of attention, and it will raise a lot of attention for the debate. So maybe that's a good thing in terms of viewership. I was a little surprised that Fox didn't set their own agenda more firmly. To go back to a comment that John made, the Republican candidate list is diverse in some ways, but it's not diverse in other ways. So there won't be a woman among the 10 tonight. So I'll just say, because I do a lot of research on women in politics, that the Republican Party has lots of women who try to run for office. That is, they run for the nomination in the party, and they can't get past the primary electorate. There are almost as many Republican women running for Congress, running for nominations for Congress on the Republican side as there are on the Democratic side, especially if you take out incumbents running for re-election. But Republican women can't get past that primary electorate. So when we see the stage tonight and it's only the boys, you might want to ask not just about the party, but about Fox News. Is this fair? Are we really seeing what the party has to offer?
I'm interested in that question. You say that there's a lot of women who maybe are running for office in other parts of politics, but maybe on the presidential level, things are different. What do you see is behind that? Is there an explanation for that phenomenon?
So at the House and Senate level, and particularly at the House level, I want to say the Democrats have an awful record on this too. So nobody wins any prizes in this country for electing women to the House and to the Senate. We are way down the list on democracies and even not so democracies on the planet. But they have a lower win rate. They can't get past that. They just can't get past that electorate. In the state of Ohio, not a personal fan actually, but Jean Schmidt was removed. An incumbent Republican woman from this state, the last one, was removed in a primary. She probably would have won again, but she was removed by her own party in a primary contest, which she lost.
Jakiel Sanders, do you want to weigh in on that question too?
Well, I wanted to weigh in on the previous question about the helpfulness of the debate to the people, the electorate. I think something to watch out for during this debate to gauge its helpful and usefulness is whether or not the candidates are standing up there just making long speeches that aren't directly answering the questions, or if they're actually answering the questions that are presented to them, and if the questions that are presented to them are actually pressing them hard and allowing them to, us to see if they can think well on their feet, if they can make decisions that are the type of decisions that a good president would have to make, rather than just memorizing the talking points they've been memorizing for the past couple days and just regurgitating them to the moderator.
Thank you.
There really is a lot of limitations in this debate. When you have 10 candidates, and they're probably each going to get in total, get about 8 minutes of airtime, but it's going to be broken up among a bunch of different questions. There's not going to be the time for some of these in-depth or more in-depth discussion of issues that a lot of us would like to see. And I think that's just the function of having 10 people on the stage. Now, some polls indicate that the American electorate would like to have seen all the candidates. Imagine 17 candidates, right? I mean, just the logistics of this becomes very, very difficult.
It's enough to play a baseball game almost.
Almost.
Where's our next question here from the audience? Yes, sir.
First, thank everybody. Thank you for the panel for coming out. Great questions and feedback. Me being a young African-American male, 31 and African-American and left-handed, so that makes me a triple minority, right? So my question is, at the end of the day, the Republican Party has failed for the past better part of a decade as far as taking care of a White House seat or a presidential election. I definitely believe that they have a good interest in wanting to change the failure that's happened in the past 8 years. We're on the same side. If you put lipstick on a pit bull, it's not a prom queen, it's still a pit bull. So them trying to cater to Cleveland, is that, or just some of the things they're doing now, should we believe that as sincere, or should we believe this debate is just going to be, hey, stick to what we know we can't get in trouble with, or should we even try the inclusion effort and try to sell that whole sincerity pitch?
And to your question, there has been some discussion among Republicans about reaching out to African-American voters. The party attempted something in Ohio recently to reach out, so it seems like it is something the party is thinking about. Who wants to take this question? Jakiel.
I'll take a whack at it. I know Jeb Bush, during his announcement speech, made a point to point out the demographics of his audience, that it wasn't the typical primary-based GOP audience. So I think he is trying to reach out and move beyond just running towards the base, and I think he did say early on that he would, he'd like to run a campaign where he could, maybe lose the primary but still win the nomination. But as Karen pointed out earlier, you can't do that in public. It's not possible. But another candidate that I've been watching over the past few years that's been, really trying to reach out to the African American community has been Rand Paul. He's been making quiet inroads with the NAACP and reaching out to various African American organizations, and he's currently sponsoring legislation for sentencing reform with Senator Cory Booker in the Senate.
And we've seen the Democratic Party so far in this election cycle has, in some ways, been forced to answer questions from the Black Lives Matter movement that has, we've seen gain a lot of traction since Ferguson a year ago. It's not clear quite yet what part the Republicans might play in that interaction or in that movement. Do you have any thoughts on where the Republican Party may have to address the issues that are being raised about police, even in the city of Cleveland?
I think right now the Republican Party is trying to stay far away from that issue as possible, as to not offend any sensibilities. They're not trying to touch it, and honestly, because it tends to be much more of a liberal progressive issue, and the Democratic Party has such a much larger African American support, there aren't African Americans pushing on Republicans on that issue. I think that might be a bit of a downside to this, primary season, is that a lot of African Americans that care about these issues, that we're going to have to choose between these two, a Republican and a Democrat in November. We're not going to show up during these early phases to try and feel out who is ultimately going to be one half of the two choices we're going to have.
Some people have referred to this issue of police right now as being, one of the major civil rights questions that we face in our day. Do you think, for our whole panel, do you think that Republicans can make any attempt to diversify who's voting for them without stepping up and addressing this issue?
I think it'll be interesting to see if they're asked about that in the discussion tonight. And then I think will also be interesting to see how people answer. So some people who are governors or have been governors are governors of very diverse states, and they've had to win in those states by appealing to a wide variety of audiences and being sensitive to them and know how to talk to them. So it'll be interesting to see who will be able to do that if they're asked about it. And race issues and policing issues in the July public opinion polling are issues that they're not right at the top, but they're not negligible. They're low double digits or just slightly below. Again, it'll be interesting to see if they're asked about it and then to see who's able to handle it.
And speaking of polling, we've even seen outside of electoral polling a huge shift in the past year in American attitudes about race. I think for the first time in many years, a majority of whites saying more needs to be done in this country to ensure that African Americans have equal rights. This is a big shift in public opinion that's happened in just the past year. John Green, do you think that that's going to play any sort of role on the Republican side of the coin here in the primary debates?
I don't know how big of a role it will play in the early going. for many of the reasons that we discussed. But I think as we get farther into the primaries and then when we get to the general election, I think it will play a very big role. Because as you've indicated, there has been a substantial shift in the attitudes of Americans, particularly white Americans, about issues of race and civil rights, and especially among young voters. And to the extent that Republican candidates want to try to recover some of the youth vote that they've had in the past, these are issues that they're going to have to address.
Do we have another question from our audience? Yes, sir.
Yes, in the 2012 election, Mr. Obama won with 56 million votes. Mr. Romney received 51 million votes. But there were nearly 100 million people who could have voted but did not vote. Mike, we don't know too much. Pew Research did a survey, I understand, on the party of non-voters. If we look at this group of people as a wild card, certainly if they have the numbers to choose any candidate, is there any of the candidates who have a chance of getting that wild card into play?
Karen Beckwith?
Well, it assumes first that those who didn't vote actually had access to the ballot. So let me just make a little pitch about access to voting rights. So that's one thing. To make it easy to vote, to make it available to people who want to vote, to make it something that is a pleasurable civic duty. I remember going to vote in early voting with my daughter, who is here in the audience, at the Employment Center on Talmadge Avenue in Akron. And I vote in Summit County. Everyone was there. People who didn't look like my neighbors necessarily, people who are a lot older than I am, a lot younger. Everybody was there. It was a wonderful civic experience. So let me just give that little shout out to you. It's wonderful to have really good access to voting and to have it early and one vote per person. It's a good idea. But secondly, there is something about the ability of only two parties to summarize all of the issues, all of the attraction and importance in a presidential election campaign for a nation of 350 million people. And so certainly the parties are about as different now as they've been in probably 50 years. So polarization is a big issue. So we can't say, as George Wallace once said, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties. Right now there's about $1 billion worth of super PAC money difference between the two parties. So, but unfortunately, or fortunately, however one wants to look at it, our electoral system, our electoral law makes it difficult for new parties to start and get traction. And so that's a problem.
And it's interesting because of the polarization, one of the strategies of the parties is, base mobilization. Let's try to get our strong supporters to turn out. And the parties have been pretty good at that. But those types of strategies often alienate the folks who are in the middle, right? We often talk about how American elections are won in the middle. Well, a lot of those people are not motivated to turn out and vote because they don't see anything in it for them. And the high levels of dissatisfaction with the political process play into that. Some people become very motivated by dissatisfaction. Other people decide they're going to watch baseball, right? Because that's more attractive to them. So there's a delicate balance here that candidates have to play. Some strategies that mobilize one kind of voter actually turn off and demobilize other kinds of voters.
Jakiel?
I was going to say the same thing. John Green said he stole all my thunder.
Another question here from our audience.
All right.
Yes.
Good evening, and thank you very much to the panel and to the moderator. This has been a fantastic discussion. My question goes back to a couple of points that were raised earlier. Jakiel made a great point about student loans and infrastructure and a lot of the issues that affect our generation in a huge way. And the panel also discussed how to create a broad tent and welcome people, especially in the younger generation, into these types of discussions. My question is in terms of expectations for tonight's debate, how much do you expect for issues that affect our generation, such as infrastructure, such as sustainability, such as student loan debt, to be discussed in the debate tonight?
John Green, what do you expect?
Well, a lot will depend on the questions that are asked. I don't know if any of you had a chance to see the junior debate before the one we're going to see later. But those were a very strange set of questions, particularly early on. And so a lot depends on what how the questions are framed to the candidates. But, there will be opportunities where candidates can raise issues like the ones that you've mentioned. It'll be interesting to see if they take that opportunity, if they find those to be the most important issues. I think the issue of student debt would be one that a number of the candidates might want to talk about, particularly governors who've had to deal with some of those issues in their states. So it'd just be interesting to see if it comes up. But of course, they have a limited amount of time, and there are lots of issues they could potentially bring up. So it'll just be interesting to see what their choices will be.
Do we have another question from our audience here? Yes.
Thank you. So how do you think the notion of political dynasties will play out in the eyes of voters, especially with regards to the likes of Hillary Clinton and Jeb Bush, as they are surging right now in the polls?
Karen Beckwith, political dynasties, do you think this will end up being a Bush v. Clinton election at the end of the day?
I think it very well could be. So both of those two candidates, in terms of political dynasty, they certainly have the connections, they have the access to funding, they have the experience. Those two candidates are not negligible. They have their own resume, which is valuable and important. I'm not quite sure how that will play out. I think that the one thing I do think is for both of those two candidates, they need to be prepared to answer some very specific questions. They need to be very well prepared to answer that. And I think, again, I know tonight I have said a lot about the difference between the two electorates, the primary electorate and the general electorate, but it's clear that Governor Bush has not yet been able to handle questions that deal with the dynasty question. So the question about the Iraq War, was that the right decision? He had family considerations in his head. He had considerations about the vote in his head, and he gave a very inarticulate answer. And he's not a stupid man. I think this is where one gets caught. And so I think preparation for those kinds of questions will be helpful for those candidates. And probably some thinking through some good answers and being a little brave about those answers is probably also a good idea for them.
Jakiel, I wanted to throw this to you as well. You think we've talked a little bit tonight about how candidates might appeal to a younger generation. Talking about Bushes and Clintons, does that seem like the past or the future to you?
Well, for me, as a millennial, 3 of the past 4 presidents have been a Bush or a Clinton. So I respect Hillary Clinton and both Jeb Bush. I think they are, as Karen said, both well-qualified individuals, could probably do a fantastic job with the office. But I can't help but think that among my generation, there might be a little bit of fatigue with 2 of the, basically just hopping back and forth between, one family or another. So that's what I was going to add to the conversation. And as the millennial generation, we see now not all of us are 18 and can vote, but is the largest cohort since the baby boomers. That might come into play in a general election if it is a Bush versus Clinton election.
We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Yes.
Hi. Thanks again to the City Club for an amazing event. Native Pittsburgher, proud to adopt Cleveland because of events like this, so thank you so much. I'm going to bring up an issue that overlaps with a lot of different issues. It also deals, I think, with sort of a younger generational issue, climate change. President and US EPA announced the Clean Power Plant rules on Monday. Sort of a interesting timing, I thought. He could have waited till Friday to talk about the first ever carbon regulations for power plants. I'm finding, I've been working in this field for a long time, and we have a lot of conservative folks in our membership with the National Audubon Society, and they believe in climate change. They believe it's something we need to do about it. It's not nearly as politicized at the ground level here in Ohio as it is at sort of the national rhetoric level. I'm really curious on your opinion on, the opportunity here for candidates to set themselves apart from each other, given it's such a big field. And I'm sure that the primary versus the general is going to be different with that regard. But and it's not necessarily the top tier issue right now, but I think it has a lot of potential. And I'm just curious about your opinion on where that's going to play.
John Green, where do you think climate may factor into this debate?
Well, I don't think it's going to be one of the top Republican discussions tonight. Now that I've said that, of course, it will happen. That's how I influence events, is by having strongly held predictions. And here's why. I think there are differences among the candidates on this issue. But if you think of the Republican primary electorate, which has a bias against government regulation, of one kind or another, most kinds anyway. I think that's an issue that will come out later. I don't see it coming out initially. I think, though, in a general election, that's going to be one of the top issues, and both nominees will have to address it. And there are many people who disagree on the science, but there are many larger number of people who don't disagree on the science, they disagree on the policy. And that's, I think, a very different kind of debate.
I think we've got time for one more question from the audience here. Yes.
One of the most important pieces of legislation that happened recently, or not legislation, but ramifications, is the legalization of gay marriage across the U.S. I know the panelists have already said that it is an issue that will probably not come up, but given that a lot of the candidates, when asked about this, have couched their answers to a significant degree, what do you think their possible ramifications, especially regarding those oops moments, would be if that was to come up during this debate?
And the question was, I think Rick Santorum did address a question about same-sex marriage in the earlier debate, so it already has come up as well. Karen Beckwith, where do you think same-sex marriage may play into this debate?
So I'm a little surprised it was asked at the earlier debate. So it will depend if it is asked in the subsequent debate. I would advise Republican candidates to say the court has spoken, and so therefore let's move on. In the general election, obviously the LGBT community has other issues, including employment discrimination protections. Those will be harder to handle. Those will have economic consequences, and so I'll be interested to see if those questions are raised as well. But I'll be really surprised if there's any discussion of that by the candidates. In the same way that I said there are only right answers for ISIS and the Iran arms negotiation.
This is one of those issues that, if employed out of public sight, can help some kinds of Republican candidates mobilize voters, particularly voters that don't agree with that decision.
Can they be out of public sight, John?
That's a really good question. Today, in the world of social media, can you really do that? Can you address one audience with that issue and avoid a general audience? So it's a really good question, because if that issue is used and people know about it, where does it go? Right? I mean, are we going to be suggesting constitutional amendments? I mean, what are we going to do? I mean,
we already have Ted Cruz suggesting. Ted Cruz and Mike Huckabee suggesting constitutional amendments.
Well, there you go. That is not something that can really work in a short term, right? It takes a lot of effort to amend the Constitution. So you would think that there'd be a lot of other issues that there'd be a lot more advantages to candidates to discuss.
Jakiel Sanders, any extra thoughts on that question? Do you think same-sex marriage is an issue that Republicans might discuss, or is this a done deal now?
Again, I think the gay rights issue is similar to the racism and social justice issues, where they're just not going to touch it if they don't have to. I would like to see maybe more candidates adopt a more libertarian viewpoint like Rand Paul, where they say, well, I believe what I believe, but I think the government should get out of marriage altogether. And that, I think, finds a way to thread that line where it still it doesn't isolate, it keeps the conservative base without making a comment that you have to backtrack in the general election.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience here at the City Club, and to you, those of you joining us on 90.3 WCPN. This has been a City Club conversation about the first Republican debate of the election cycle. I'm Nick Castele from WCPN, WVIZ ideastream. We've got Jakiel Sanders from the Young Professional Senate, John Green from the University of Akron, and Karen Beckwith from Case Western Reserve University. I wanted to pose to you very quickly here lightning round questions to finish off our conversation here. Top three issues that you expect to hear Republicans address tonight. You can take about 4 seconds here to form your answers. And Jakiel, let's start with you. Top three issues you think Republicans will address tonight.
Top three they're going to address tonight are probably going to be foreign policy. It's going to be the economy, jobs, and possibly healthcare.
John Green?
I think job growth, international relations, and the size of the federal deficit.
Karen Beckwith, to finish us off here, last word, top three questions.
Foreign policy, economic questions. I don't know if they'll be about job growth. They won't be about unemployment, and they won't be about wage stagnation. Healthcare, probably.
And healthcare. Well, thank you very much. Karen Beckwith, the chair of the Political Science Department at Case Western Reserve University. John Green, the director of the Racy Bliss Institute of Applied Politics at the University of Akron. And Jakiel Sanders, the chair for Government Affairs at the Young Professional Senate. Thank you to all three of you for a great conversation. Thank you very much to our audience for your great questions. And now you can turn on your TV and we'll get to the debate. Thank you all very much.